Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. Howdy folks, and welcome to the month in review for March 2025. If you haven't already, please make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, leave a comment if you like. It really helps with the algorithm, and I appreciate it, and it allows me to bring you more videos like this one. So, as always, let's begin with our honorable mentions for the painting competition. There were a lot in the solo category, and picking just 3 was actually very difficult. So I'm going to bend the rules just a little bit. The first honorable mention is going to be a split between Ditez and Stephen Bickle. Both of them painted the same model, both did a really bold paint scheme of pink, purple, and blue, and both did an excellent job of blending those colors. I honestly stared at them for a very long time trying to figure out if one would win out over the other, but I just couldn't pick one over the other. So they get to share the first honorable mention. Great job to both of you. The next honorable mention in the solo category goes to Lucas Eisenring. And while he painted the exact same model, he gets the mention for not trying to tackle an interesting spectrum of colors, but instead for painting in white. White is notoriously difficult to work with, and to clean it if you make a mistake and accidentally smudge some paint. But here, Lucas has painted it nice, crisp, and clean, and yet still, around the feet, has added the dirt and the grime to the legs to give the model some character, and not like he just took a Gundam and stuck it on a stand and put it out for the competition. The next honorable mention goes to Sneetix. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. He gets the last solo honorable mention for a number of reasons. I want you to take a very close look at this model. From the tips of the feathers to the base, every detail on this model has gotten a lot of attention. The feathers have that excellent blend from pink to purple, but then there are those extra gray paint strokes to make the feathers actually stand out and look feathery and fluffy. And then, on top of that, move down to the cloak. It looks like there's been some dry brushing there to give the cloth a worn look to it, maybe a kind of a leathery worn look to it. Then moving on to the body, it's been painstakingly detailed with every feather getting some highlight. And then lastly, that red cloth with the gold trim has some incredible non-metallic metalwork done on it, both the red and the gold. The red takes on this appearance of being almost silk or satin with that level of contrast, and the gold trim is likewise absolutely outstanding. I think the Patreon community may have glanced over this one a bit too fast because it was really well done. Moving on to the unit category, it only had 5 total entries, so the one lone honorable mention is going to go to Anthony Colello. His team of bikers is very simple and straightforward, but I really like how each bike has a different color. It kind of gives me that old Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles vibe where you take something that's otherwise very uniform, give each member a slight different color, and it gives the idea that the unit is united but still individual and unique. So nice job there. Now, while we didn't have very many unit entries, there were 8 total legendary entries, which is fairly unusual. The first honorable mention goes to Count Vamps. Now, I personally must have some kind of real bias with the purple to blue color scheme, because if it's pulled off right, I always think it looks absolutely fantastic. As I've mentioned before, when I still played 40K, I played a lot of Tzeentch, and so I'm very familiar with the blue, pink to purple scheme. Maybe that's the cause of it. But each one of those feathers is blended nicely with all the colors, but each one still looks distinct. You don't just have a dry brush being done quickly over all the brushes. Every single feather, especially around the neck, got some attention. The second honorable mention goes to Guy with his red, white, and blue scheme. The scheme looks a little bit more natural, realistic, and grimdark than the previous one, but that could just be the lighting. Guy has done a really good job of blending red into white and then white into blue. And the rest of the model, especially the gazebo that he's standing on, looks very crisp. So congrats to all the winners and to the honorable mentions. As always, I really look forward to seeing what the community can produce every month for these painting competitions. Now, on with the news. First up, there was a tiny game patch at the beginning of the month. mostly point and loadout changes for a few armies across both the Grimdark Future and the Age of Fantasy. The big updates aren't going to come until September, but it's worth taking a look to see if any of your factions had any changes. Maybe finally your hero can take that one piece of war gear that you've always thought they should take. The next item of business is significantly more, significant. OPR has announced the release of its next faction book, The Eternal Dynasty for Grimdark Future. Following the release of the book for the Duchies of Vinci, The Eternal Dynasty will be the first faction book for Grimdark Future. And it makes sense that, like Age of Fantasy, the first faction book will be a faction that's entirely unique to OnePageRules, even if it's not the most popular or most often played army, although I believe the release of these books will dramatically affect that. I'll be curious to see when the next public survey comes out in the summer to see how much the release of these faction books has changed who is playing these particular armies. But it's a good idea for OPR to nail down the lore, the background for these factions before beginning to tackle the ones that were ported over from other game systems. And if these faction books have art like the ones that they've put on the website for announcing these faction books, I'd say they're almost worth buying just for the art. And the last piece of news is a small piece of news with a really big meaning to it. The orcs were announced in the most recent live stream, but they're going to get a redesign after players suggested that the ones shown off in the live stream looked a bit generic, and I agree. When I saw them in the live stream, I looked at them and thought they basically just look like really beefy human defense force. The new designs are going to make the orky bits, like teeth, a bit more pronounced. And in order to make them seem a little bit more tribal, they're going to get some more designs, some more pieces to the armor, things like feathers and totems and fetishes and stuff like that, just to make them stick out and not look like, HDF that just are on steroids. Now, the redesign is going to set back the STL releases a little bit, but this shows that OPR is still listening to their players, and I think that's worth a tiny delay. Now, believe it or not, that's all the news for March. April will probably be a lot bigger, though, with the report on Adepticon and some of the other things coming down the pipe. So now, let's move on to the STL releases for the month. To begin with, we've got the terrain pieces for the month. They seem to have enough variety that they could almost be painted to represent any kind of climate. There's sand, so you could go coastline or desert. There's palm trees for jungle. There's massive rocks. And on second glance, maybe that's not sand. Maybe that's just generic ground. Paint it light khaki and it's sand. Paint it a darker brown, and it can be dirt. Paint it green, and it can be grass. There's even building ruins and pottery added into some flavor. So however you paint it, I think, will really determine what kind of a climate, vegetation, and geography these pieces will actually look like. The only thing you couldn't do is snow, at least not on the pieces with palm trees. That would just look a little bit awkward. The pieces with bushes and shrubbery, though, you could paint to look like a winterscape. Now, moving on, we have the quest model, a vampire berserker / barbarian for Age of Fantasy quest. Overall, the design is fine. The pose is dynamic and menacing, but to be honest, it kind of looks like a child. It's supposed to be female, but when I saw her during the live stream, and again here when I was looking to write the script for this, I kept thinking it looks like either a child, a tween, with a "can I speak to your manager" haircut. Now, while I might not be a total fan of that model, the next one is the Human Defense Force Titanic tank. And while I've been pretty harsh on the vehicle designs for the HDF, I think this one is done just right. By breaking up the tracks into multiple pieces, giving the tanks some geometric variety that the other tanks are missing. To me, they looked kind of brickish or blocky, but this one looks a lot more angular, much more futuristic. The turret has lots of angles and texture. The tank doesn't feel like just a big hunk or block or brick. It feels like a futuristic, heavily armored vehicle. The only real downside I see is it's going to take folks with a smaller build plate a little while to print up all those pieces. And that mortar out front looks a little suspect. Either that's a very powerful artillery piece, or that tank is just happy to see me. Moving on is the munitioner for the HDF. When Tano introduced these in the live stream, he said he wanted to make them just covered in guns and ammo, and I think he pulled it off. shotgun in one hand, another rifle slung over the shoulder, sidearm and grenades on the belt, bandolier across the chest. Any more in the model would risk crossing over into being comical, which would make it stick out from the army in a bad way. The visor does give the model a nice Terminator feel to it, but if there isn't going to be an option for a totally helmeted version, I would say that's a rather unfortunate omission. Some players might not want any models to be showing their faces and to be fully helmeted, so if other models have that option, then these guys should as well. Now moving on, we've got the recruits. And a big thank you to OPR for making them noticeably different from regular HDF troops. When I used to play my Imperial Guard in 40k, it was always irritating that there weren't different models to separate my regular guardsmen from conscripts. You could do a different paint scheme, but then the models were committed, and you didn't want to have to pay for more and more models just to paint them slightly differently to have conscripts versus regular troopers. So, good job to OPR for making a distinct design for the recruits, and of course, giving them no armor to speak of is actually kind of funny, since the HDF hasn't quite decided if their lives are actually worth trying to preserve. I suppose the big irony here is that all the detail and texture on these guys might make them take longer to paint than the regular troops. So we'll have to see if that investment in painting means they get blown off the table faster or if they stick around a little bit more. But if your guys' experience with new model syndrome is anything like mine, they're going to die quickly anyways. Now moving on, we've got more of the Human Defense Force mechs, the combat walkers. And like the light mechs that are more range focused, these ones look pretty solid. In fact, oddly enough, I could see printing some of these up. In fact, printing up an entire army of the larger ones of these mechs and running them as Titan Lords. There's enough variety, and the models are big enough that if you were to paint them with a bit more color and add some heraldry or special markings or something like that, these guys would make really solid Titan Lords. Of course, you could also paint them to combine with your HDF army because, that's what they were designed for. After these, we move on to the APC attack vehicles that are giving me some pretty strong Tarox vibes from the 40k Scions. And just like those, I always wondered how many incidents of friendly fire there were from dudes climbing out of the vehicle and getting shot by the autocannon located right behind the door. Still, it has a nice armored look to it. The swivel turrets on top give it a little bit of nice variety, and it's got enough angles and variety to keep it looking like a brick while still looking like a solid, sturdy vehicle. Moving on to the Wood Elves, we get a look at the Eternals. This subfaction, if you want to call it that, of the Wood Elves, take after inspiration from insects. So we've had the elves, then there's the tree creatures and the animal creatures, and now we've got the insects. So all of them have this look of being covered by bug, carapace, or shell. There's subtle differences separating the soldiers from the heroes. I think the elders look pretty good. I like that sickle-like staff that you can equip them with. And the spellweavers also have a pretty solid pose, and they're easy to clearly define them as casters rather than frontline creatures, especially with that cloak that they're wearing. Now, if you're going to play Eternals, I would highly recommend printing the ones that at least have that Wolverine blade if you're going to go melee rather than them having bows. The standard ones here, without any wings, without any weapons, look really, really bare. I'm sure the data slate for them, those claws are probably pretty good, but just the look of them, they look like a kid who showed up to high school and forgot his homework. Equip them with something. Now the hunters, on the other hand, I think they look really good. They're big, they're covered in heavy armor, and you can equip them with those really good-looking scythe weapons. And last of all, we got these chunky boys. Now, going back to my high school reference, these look like the football linebackers when they have all of their padding on. They look menacing, they look tough, and one of the players in the local Slow Grow League printed up one of these guys. They're pretty good. They're about the size of a Space Marine Dreadnought, and in-game, they are as strong as the models look here. Plus, if you look very, very closely, they have an elf at the core of them, which gives them that very, very interesting kind of aesthetic to it. I like it. I think they turned out really, really well. So with that, we conclude another review of the month. Make sure you check out the community page on the OPR website to check up every so often and see what new events and groups might have popped up in your area. And if there isn't one, consider being the one to start one up. Until next time, thanks for watching. Please make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. And of course, keep your dice on the table. I'll see you next time.